Go. All right, and welcome back to WVCR 88.3 Saint. I'm Justin Kenny as always, and with me tonight we have a very special guest. We have Father Rob Hagan from the Augustinians. So, Father Rob, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Justin. Good to be with you.
Same to you. And so why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
So I am an Augustinian priest. I've been so for about 30 years. Um, and I met the Augustinians when I was a student at Villanova. So I went to Villanova University. I didn't go there to become a priest. I had a good friend whose uncle was an Augustinian, which is kind of a beautiful story unto itself. He was the first quadriplegic ever ordained a priest.
Wow.
His name was Father Bill Atkinson. Father Bill Atkinson was in his first year in the seminary and was on a toboggan ride with his buddies in February, and they slammed into a tree, and he severed his spine. And from that moment on, never walked another day in his life. They didn't think he was going to make it through the night, and they got him to a hospital where he survived, and ultimately was sent to McGee Rehab, which is a wonderful rehab facility in Philadelphia. And he spent over a year there, learning how to live again. No one thought that he would want to continue to pursue his vocation, but he did. He petitioned to stay in the order, and he did stay in the order. He graduated from Villanova University, and after many years of study and prayer, he petitioned then Pope Paul VI for a dispensation because he couldn't even elevate the host. All he could move was his head and his shoulders. The dispensation was granted, and he was the first quadriplegic ever ordained in the 2,000-year history of our church. So he went on to teach for about 30 years in a local high school nearby. Weddings, funerals, chaplain on the field, basketball games, rooted for the Wildcats. I mean, just a wonderful, wonderful, full life with joy. And so that really inspired me to see him find such joy in his life as an Augustinian, and then going to Villanova, meeting more Augustinians. I didn't enter right away. I went to law school. I practiced law for 7 years in a firm inside close to Philadelphia. So I practiced in and outside of Philadelphia. I did a lot of criminal defense, a lot of trial work. And I thought that this notion of, I thought from time to time about the notion of becoming Augustinian, but I thought it would go away. I kind of hoped it would go away because I thought I wanted to do other things with my life. And it never did. And so I think that's kind of what a calling is. I used to think a calling was you get struck by lightning. Moses saw the burning bush. St. Paul was knocked off his horse. I think I came to understand a calling can be a tap on the shoulder or a whisper in your heart. And so I started to listen to that whisper. I left the law firm. I entered the Augustinians. 6 years later, I was ordained on the campus of Villanova University and assigned to work in compliance in the athletics department because then Father Dobbin, the president of Villanova, knew I had the law degree. He thought, with the Augustinian charism and also the practicality of what might be needed in the athletics department. And so I served for 20 years as associate athletics director on the campus. I worked closely with, Coach Wright. Andy Talley was on the bench and the sideline for 3 national championships. Had wonderful relationships with the students, student athletes, a lot of weddings, and just journey with them. And 3 years ago, my brothers elected me to this office that I serve in now as prior provincial. So I get to serve kind of as the shepherd for our province of St. Thomas of Villanova, which would be, the East Coast Augustinians in the United States. And so, obviously, the news recently was a real point of pride for Augustinians around the world. Particularly those of us who knew, know Pope Leo, then Father Bob, and we're very, very excited for what he can bring to our church and the people, the flock.
Yeah. I mean, you guys stole my thunder there with the last bit there because I was going to say to address the elephant in the room with with Pope Leo being a Augustinian, but you kind of did that already. But one thing is, I mean, obviously, like you said, you've lived a wide, varying time from being a lawyer to associate athletic director, being a prior. Um, One thing you did mention though too is that you are the prior of your province. Now, Siena being a Franciscan university, we have the same thing over there, but the Franciscans decided to merge all provinces into one, being Holy Name Province. But we have currently both the former prior, I believe, of Holy Names, Father Kevin, is also former president, and currently Brother Michael Perry is the former um, prior of the entire order. He was the one, if you didn't see, he was the one that gave the Siena shirt to Pope Francis. Because even though Pope Francis wasn't a Franciscan, he was a Jesuit. Him taking the Franciscan name kind of made the Franciscans kind of adopt him as their own. But can you go a little bit into the role of the prior, kind of what you do, and kind of like how you lead as a prior? Because many people might think of just like, oh, you just lead a province. But what exactly goes into being a prior?
Thank you, Justin. It's a great question, and it's interesting to hear you talk about the Franciscan journey because that's a challenge for us as three provinces. And a lot of diminishment has happened in the church and in various orders in terms of numbers and vocations. And so, we have what we call FANA, which would be the Federation of Augustinians in North America. And so while we haven't, completely unified into one, there's a lot of collaboration that we look to do as the three provinces. Maybe someday we will be one province because it's just practical to, when you think about terms of vocation directors and houses and, just to be more efficient in personnel. And so as prior provincial for the province of St. Thomas of Villanova, I think in some ways it's not unlike kind of being a general manager, if you will. There's a lot of practical realities that you have to deal with in terms of personnel, assignments, facilities, fundraising, recruiting. So, it is in a lot of ways, it's a nonprofit business. But at the same time, there is also kind of a pastoral role here that you kind of get to serve as the shepherd for your brothers.
Yeah.
And so, if we're just running like a business, that's not all we're called to be, right? We're called to a way of life. We live the rule of Saint Augustine. We're called to a brotherhood, a prayer life, and so as prior provincial, part of my responsibility is making sure that we're attending to those spiritual values that we committed ourselves to. Why? So that we can share that with the people we serve.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned that, like, for example, numbers are going down. This is one thing that you hear kind of across the board is not only just like attendance numbers are going down, especially here in the first world, like Europe and America, but we're hoping Pope Leo provides kind of a jolt to that. But also that the number of people entering the priesthood and vocations is dwindling and it's going way down. I mean, like I think of my church that I attend, besides whenever I go to Mass at Siena, the priest there is overseeing like three different parishes all by himself. And that's kind of normal up here in the Albany area. Um, Like you got 9 o'clock mass at one church and 11 at another, and it's just he oversees three parishes at once. But then you also see just less and less people joining. This is kind of a two-parter, but what do you think is the reasoning behind that? And what do you think is kind of the cure for that, looking at that issue?
Well, you're spot on. We are stretched as ministers, and I think that there are a lot of reasons why there is what you might call a secularization going on in our world. We're just very, very distracted.
Yeah,
We have a lot of things that vie for our attention with our phones and the internet, and just opportunities that we have, and none of those things are bad. None of them are bad, but it is always comes down to how we use them and how we set up our priorities. If you look at something as simple as the Ten Commandments, there's a reason why the first commandment is the first commandment.
yeah,
Love God, above all else, and I think for most people, they would say, they have a relationship with God, they believe that there's a presence of God, but it doesn't necessarily take that primary space in our life because there's so many other things that vie for that space. And so as Augustinians, that Augustine would very much identify with that, and he called that the restless heart. Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so when you and I, and we go to college, and we want to get a job, and we want to go to parties, and we're on the internet, and we want to connect, on social media, and before we know it, we're running around, kind of chasing all these things that Augustine chased, and it ultimately was like drinking salt water. It just made him thirstier. And so I think what we have now, Justin, is we might have an opportunity to maybe realign some of our priorities, to maybe put some things down that are occupying too much space in my head and my heart. And I think Pope Leo, offers us that, especially as American Catholics. Here's a man that, could have done anything else with his life. He was accepted to Harvard Law School. He's an extremely bright man who speaks multiple different languages, who chose to go dedicate and serve his life for 20 years of his life with the poorest of the poor in Peru. To understand that life isn't just about getting mine, that real purpose and meaning in life comes from giving yourself to something bigger than yourself. And so I think your generation, I think there are people who are a little dissatisfied with some of the other things that don't deliver like the fulfillment that we think it's going to promise, and have an appetite and a desire for a connectivity to something bigger and something more. So I'm hoping that Pope Leo is offering kind of an opportunity for renewal. I will say our vocation director has been very busy the last 2 weeks. There was a Francis bump, and I think we're experiencing a Leo bump, that a lot of people did not know that there was even an Augustinian order. And when he went out on that balcony and confessed himself boldly to be a son of Augustine, I think for the next several weeks, Augustine and Augustinian was one of the most Googled words. And so my vocation director has said that in the first weekend, we had 100 inquirers. And since the first weekend, we had another 100 inquirers. You got 200 people who were discerning vocations, who were already graduated from college, that did not know that there was an Augustinian order. Now, are they all going to enter? Probably not.
yeah,
But is there a discerning appetite out there? That doesn't mean everybody has to become an Augustinian or a Franciscan.
yeah,
But I'm excited about people considering, meaningful alternatives to their life.
yeah. And I mean, you point out that not many people probably even knew that there was an Augustinian order. And it's also like the same thing I point out to like there was a time where I interviewed a Franciscan friar on here, and my mom runs this Catholic school named after Mother Teresa that my grandmother founded because Catholic schools were closing. She didn't want to have like Catholic schools just die in the area. So I said to my mom, like, hey, there's this friar who said he'd love to come and talk to the kids about St. Francis. And my mom goes like, what's a friar? And this is somebody who's been a cradle Catholic her entire life, doesn't know anything else. I'm just like, wait, mom, you've had a son that went to Siena for 7 years, and then your brother went to Siena, is one of the biggest donors to Siena, and you don't know what a friar is? And she goes like, yeah. And I was like, well, everybody knows what a monk is because of Hollywood and everything, but like, it's just like also too, you think about it, there's so many orders out there too. Like I went to a LaSallian high school run by the LaSallian brothers,
Hmm.
and not many people
Christian
would,
Brothers.
yeah, not many other people would know that they exist unless they went to school there. Like Marist has the Marist brothers. I didn't even know Marist
Yeah.
was a Catholic school at one point until I went there to visit a friend. He's like, "Oh, hey, here comes one of the brothers." I was like, "Brothers?" He was like, "Yeah, the Marist brothers." I was like, "What are they?" And but when you think about it, there are many different other obstacles that also come to it to today's world. Like I can tell you about a couple people I knew who went into the religious life where either they applied but then they were denied, or they went through like 2 or 3 years and they were kind of bumped due to the psychological testing or whatever. But then also other people bring in things like, oh, what about the student loan issue today with people coming in with student loans where you can't really come in with financial burdens. When you hear things like that, how do you kind of address that to people who are considering kind of your life of being a priest or an Augustinian or any other order?
I would tell anybody who's considering it to pursue it. It's a beautifully fulfilling life, Justin.
Yeah,
No life is perfect, right? No life is perfect. So, talk to your when you get a little older, or, if you have some married friends, they have their challenges. There's challenges in any walk of life, but in religious life, there is a particular structure, a routine of prayer, of community, of service. A lot of our Menican orders are teaching orders where you have an opportunity to, preach and teach and work with others. There is a mission component to this, as we saw with Pope Leo. Spent so much of his time in our missions in Peru, and so it's an exciting journey. And
yeah,
so, if one is thinking about it, I think to find somebody that could maybe walk with you a little bit, have a cup of coffee, and just talk about what it means to be a friar. What are your days like? What are some of the challenges? What are the joys? And you're right. I mean, there is kind of a process. There's what we call kind of an associate part where you kind of walk and journey with a friar. There would be an application process. There is some vetting that needs to be done because, there are challenges to live in community and to make sure that people are really called to this way of life. And so those kind of practical realities happen. There's a what you might call an orientation period where you're
yeah,
you're you're living with friars, but you haven't taken vows yet. And sometimes it's perfectly natural for somebody to say, look, I tried this, but I don't think it's for me. Or maybe you're not called to community life, or I think sometimes people are called to the ministry. Like, I want to be a teacher. I want to be a teacher at Siena. Well, there's more to being a Franciscan than just teaching at Siena, right? There's a whole, prayer and community life piece. And so I think you don't know until you explore it. But I'm really excited about people who are willing to take the road less traveled.
yeah,
If you go to a vocation, a career fair on campus, there might not always be a table with the Franciscans or the Augustinians there, but to consider it as a life choice, I think is really a smart thing to do.
yeah. And I mean, it's one thing I see sometimes at Siena, and I mean, not to keep on bragging it back to Siena, because I know this is an Augustinian interview, but it's just that like the Franciscans are like the most. I mean, like I eat lunch at the Priory like once every month, or once every other month, because I'm very close with one or two of them. But there have been some of them who've been kind of like you said, kind of like quote unquote interns, friars, where
Yeah.
one stayed and they lived with them. He headed up the what was it, the Damietta Center, the Cross Cultural Center, and then we had another one who left. He ended up later on converting to Islam, but he was considering for a bit. But one of the things I will say I like about your answers with these questions is that it's not just jumping to the most extreme conclusion.
No.
A lot of people,
Right.
especially people maybe my age and maybe somewhere on the more extreme liberal side of Catholicism, the more progressive side, say, oh, the only way to fix this is to be either A, married priests, or B, women priests. And
Mhm.
what I like about it is that you're not just jumping to the most extreme conclusion. And I would like to hear kind of like why you think it's not necessary to jump to just the most extreme conclusion of that.
Well, we're talking about a way of life, and we're also talking about what's going on in the world and society. And so, if the Pope came out, today and declared that priests could marry, we friars, that wouldn't affect us one bit because we've taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We've pledged our life to something else,
Yeah.
and we live that out as a priest. But that doesn't, that doesn't define who we are. And I don't think that because there's a shortage that's a reason unto itself to do anything. That there's an inherent um, uh, part of the calling that is between you and your relationship with God, and we invite anybody to explore that and then see where that takes you without, like you say, jumping to the conclusion. And there are a lot of ways to serve in the church. There are a lot of roles, and we have a discernment house where guys and women could come and have dinner. We'll have mass, we'll have prayer and mass and dinner at an Augustinian house on campus, and
Yeah.
just kind of see and get to know us as people and see the human side and the relatability side, and then hear about the challenges and kind of see how we live. I think that sometimes people don't explore it because they think that they can't get close to it. And I think as Franciscans on that campus, or Augustinians, and to cultivate relationships where people have a friendship first. Augustine was a core value for Augustine was friendship, that we see and experience and encounter the presence of God in and through one another. And so, through a meal, through a service project, through a conversation. It doesn't always have to be some kind of formal study, where you kind of come to see the presence of God in and through our relationships.
Yeah. And now I kind of also, because I know this is you're an Augustinian, so I do want to kind of shift the interview now a little bit over to St. Augustine himself. For those who might not know who St. Augustine is, I mean, I've known a little bit about him, but obviously not everybody does. Can you just go into kind of who he was and what his message is and kind of
I
what
would
he sent?
would recommend anybody doing a short Google of St. Augustine, because what
Yeah,
you'll find is a major pillar in Western civilization. So whether you're religious or not, and non-religious people will recognize Augustine as an intellectual heavyweight. He was born in 354, he died in 430. So we're talking about, 1600 years ago. And I think people will find him to be very relatable because he was a sinner before he was a saint.
yeah,
And he chased much of what you and I chase. And he wasn't finding fulfillment, and he wasn't finding peace. And his mother is Saint Monica. And so she's a wonderful patron for parents who think their children are going off the deep end. And she never gave up on her son. She was praying for her son that he would find his way. They call Augustine son of tears because he was the product of a lot of prayer and tears of his mother, who prayed that he would find his way. And he didn't convert until he was 32 years old, after having pursued a lot of the other things that you and I chase. And he was very smart, and he was very gifted, and he could have done a lot of other things with his life. But he came to the conclusion in his famous work, The Confessions of St. Augustine. And people think that's a confession of all the sins, all the bad stuff that he did. And some of that is in there. But it's also a confession of praise, that through every aspect of his life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the up, the down, the success and the failure, God was with me. God never abandoned me. And God forgave me, and God picked me up when I fell down. And so it's called the Confessions of St. Augustine, where he says, Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. And so we have a sinner who is a saint. We have somebody who knew how to fail, who knew he needed God's mercy and love, and didn't really find his way until later in life. And then he took all the gifts that God had given him, his intellect, his faith, his friends, and he formed a community of faith in service to God's people. And so I think people would find inspiration from him. A lot of communities sprung up after he died, living under the rule of St. Augustine. And it wasn't until 1244 that Pope Innocent asked these communities to band together. And that's when the formal order of St. Augustine was formed. And so we take our charism and our inspiration from Augustine, but we were also founded by the church in 1244. And then since then, we serve in missions and schools and parishes all around the world.
Yeah, that was one thing I was always wondering because, like, I noticed that, like, yeah, he lived back in the 300s and the 400s, but his order wasn't founded until the 12th, 13th century. So I always wondered, like, how did that kind of occur? That was like 700 years after he died, 800, 900. I can't math this early.
Neither can I.
How how there was kind of that big gap between what was done, but you kind of just cleared it up for me. That was kind of just a network. And then Pope Leo, it was another Pope Leo, as you said, right? That kind of just basically said you
Well,
need.
this was Pope Innocent the
Oh,
Fourth.
innocent. Sorry, I heard Pope Leo for some
But
reason.
but Leo the 14th took great inspiration from Pope Leo the 13th.
Yes.
I mean, that's a little segue because of Leo took a lot of his charism from Augustine the 13th, as and also the plight of the poor, of the worker. And so
Yeah.
they're real two hallmarks for our current Pope Leo the 14th.
Yeah, everybody's been talking about now Rerum Novarum too, the encyclical.
Yes,
That's one thing that's been blowing up
yes,
lately. Is everybody talking about that?
yes.
And to be honest with you, I was kind of shocked to hear Leo being well, first off, I was shocked to see here an American be named Pope. That was something I would never thought I would see. But second off, I was kind of surprised to hear Leo, especially because like it's been over 100 years or so since the last Pope Leo reigned. I mean, my great grandmother who passed away in
Yeah.
2006, she was born in 1909. She didn't even see a Pope Leo. He died like six
Right.
years before her. But like it's always kind of interesting and fascinating to see what names they choose because also you can kind of see what their I guess their initiative is going to be going forward because like Pope Francis chose Francis, so he was Jesuit, but that kind of if you look at his whole entire work as Pope in this papacy fits. I mean now Pope Leo's just starting, but we'll see what he does. I've been saying to a couple of friends, I'm still waiting. I'm now waiting on the encyclical on AI.
Yeah, I know. That's coming. He's
Oh
got a
yeah.
sweet spot for that. And I think, I think you're good to do a kind of a podcast like this because I think it opens up the richness and the tradition of our faith. So, a lot of people would think our faith is like about going to mass, and that's a big part of us, our
Yeah,
Eucharistic body of Christ. But look at all the tools in the toolbox that we have.
yeah,
Apostolic succession. That our line of leadership and shepherds goes all the way back to Saint Peter. And the tradition, um, and the inspiration that we take from that line. The communion of saints. For people to go, Google around and find a saint whose life resonates with your own.
yeah,
I happen to have been born on May 22nd, which is the feast of Saint Rita. And Rita was an Augustinian nun who's the patron of impossible causes and known as a peacemaker. She wanted to be a nun early on in her life, but she was put into an arranged marriage by her family, and the marriage was a difficult one. And
yeah,
she wound up losing her husband and two sons. And so she went through great hardship and overcame it all with faith. And so, I often think maybe she tapped me on the shoulder as part of my vocation story,
yeah,
to connect with a Francis if you love animals or creation, to connect with Saint Joseph, who was a carpenter and a builder. Reach into the toolbox of the tradition of our faith and pull some things out that will help you, live a better life. The rosary. People talk a lot about anxiety these days, and I can't calm down and I can't rest my mind. To just spin around the decade of a rosary and watch how your blood pressure comes down and the clarity in your mind is restored. There's different faith practices like meditation and things that we have, adoration, that I think a lot of people are like, oh, I didn't know about that, or I did that in third grade and then I forgot about that. And so, let's remember the tools we have.
yeah. And I love that you refer to them as tools because one of the things that led to me reaching out to you was that I've noticed in the past that I've just really been interviewing Franciscans. And there's nothing wrong with Franciscans. I love the Franciscans. I owe my
Right,
Siena years to them.
right, right.
Uh, but I kind of wanted to branch out and talk to more orders. Like I've reached out to you. I've been working with a Trappist monk to set up something with him. I've been working with some Dominican sisters. It even reached across to the Protestant side because I did grow up
Sure.
partially Protestant because my father was a
Yeah.
Congregationalist. And actually, ironically, you'll like this. Little side note: the Lutheran pastor when I interviewed him, he said something to me that was like, "You might." It's like, "Hey, you want to know what's really cool about this new pope?" It's like, "What?" And he goes, "Just like he's from the same Augustinian order as Martin Luther."
Exactly.
So now even the Lutherans are excited about the pope.
I had this friend of mine. He was an Augustinian. He was a character. Everybody knew him.
Yeah,
I said he was the most famous Augustinian since Martin Luther.
yeah,
But now I can't say that anymore because now we got Leo. So,
yeah.
I got to move it down on the list.
Well, yeah, yeah. But it's so fascinating just to see like what kind of each order offers. And I mean, like I was talking with like the Trappist, and he went into this whole entire thing about how with monks, they all seem to stream from Benedict, and they're all kind of Benedictine, but they all take it in different counts. Like he said, the Trappists basically got tired of being too close to civilization, but they didn't want to be hermits, or they felt the monasteries were getting too big, so they kind of came like in the middle. And then you have the Carthusians, who are pretty much just complete hermits
Yeah.
and do everything by themselves. Um, I will admit, I would probably go insane being a Carthusian.
Me too. Me too.
Um,
That was one of the appealing things about the Augustinian charism, Justin, and you're spot on because every order has a little bit of a nuanced charism.
yeah,
For Augustine, we were very much contemplative and active. So we really balance both of those. We have a mendicant, real appreciation for community and personal prayer, and yet from that space, then go and
yeah,
be in the world, but not of the world. but very much, in active ministry. So that is part of the charism, the contemplative and the active side that exists in the Augustinian order.
Yeah, and I mean, like you touched on this, and I've touched on this too in this interview. But one thing I've always been kind of fascinated with is kind of like what each order's specialization is, if they see themselves as having one. Like the Dominicans are the orders of preachers; their specializations preachers. Um, some people refer to Jesuits as kind of the intellectual branch of the Catholic Church. Then when I talked to Father Kevin Mullen, who's the former president of Siena, the former the prior head of finance for Holy Land Province, he told me it's just like we don't have a specialization. Francis was very like you're going to have several different jobs. Don't specialize in just one thing. What do you see as the specialization for the Augustinians if you have?
For Augustine clearly would have emphasized community, be a community of believers. So you will rarely see an Augustinian living on his or her own. That we live in community, and we're called to build community, to welcome people into it, to be unifiers and bridge builders. It's one of the things that Pope Leo has commented on, and hopefully will act upon. And
Yeah,
so that a core Augustinian value is hospitality, to be a welcoming, inviting people. You know, but I wouldn't want to shortchange the academic, intellectual pursuit that was very Augustinian. And so just because we emphasize community doesn't mean that we don't really pay attention to scholarship and higher education and
yeah,
those things that we do are very much involved in. But like people at our schools will say, you do it in this way. And so, people will come to Villanova, and obviously you're going to get a top-notch education, but you're also going to feel very much a part of a community, and that's very intentional. And that's part of hopefully the ethos, the culture that we try to build around our ministries.
yeah. I mean, we got about 10 minutes left here, a little less than 10 minutes. Um, so I kind of also wanted to go into um, also too with Augustine quickly. I mean, I don't know how quickly you can be with this, but Augustine is credited with creating the topic of or the notion of original sin. And for I don't know if this is something that you're big expert on, but can you kind of go in for people in the audience of what original sin is, what it means, and how's it, I guess, relate to Augustine?
Well, clearly, he was a proponent of baptism. Um, and as a convert himself, he was inspired by the preaching of Ambrose, and very much attributed his conversion um, to the friendship that he built with Ambrose, the prayers of his mother that ultimately led to his baptism. And so Augustine is known in the church as the doctor of grace. And so there was a heresy back in Augustine's time called Pelagianism. And Pelagianism is something that we all can fall into. And that is, if I do enough good works, I will earn my way into heaven. And it's really the opposite, that God did the good work. God initiated this. God created us. God sent his son into the world to show us how to live, to show us how to accept suffering, to show us how to treat one another, to die and to rise for us for the forgiveness of our sins. And so we are made by God, but we are made as human beings with kind of a hole in our heart that can only be filled and healed by the grace of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
So we need baptism. We need that grace. We need to be in that right relationship with God in order to then go forth and do all the good that we're called to do, but not because it's on our own strength. It's through our relationship with God and through God's grace. So we need baptism, and we need the sacraments. because on our own, we are nothing. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And so we got a couple more minutes left. So usually I like to end the interviews kind of on this type of question. We've talked about a lot, obviously, but we haven't been able to talk about everything. Obviously, it takes more than 45 minutes to tell everybody about the whole entire notion of Augustinian order. But with these few minutes left, is there anything that you haven't got a chance to say yet, but you really want to say? And if so, now's your time.
Well, thank you, Justin. I really appreciate the invitation here. I appreciate what you're doing with your podcast as a young person in your way with this medium, trying to reach out and share the good news with people. I would say to anybody who might stumble onto this podcast that religious life, Franciscan and in this case Augustinian way of life is a really good life, and I would invite anybody to inquire about what that means. It's a process that probably takes about 6 years. The first year is just put your toe in the water. You don't have to sign your life away. Maybe learn a little bit more about Augustine, get exposed to some philosophy, meet some other friars, understand, the relatability of who we are. Second year, go on to what they call novitiate. Very few of us would have an opportunity in life to spend a year away from a job, away from school, to have the luxury to be with other friars and learn about Augustine, to learn about the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a simplicity of life that also brings great joy, meditative prayer. And so that's a year where you get to cultivate your relationship with God. Come back and then spend the next 4 years studying theology. Theology really opens up your mind and your heart. Aquinas, Augustine, Rahner, just incredible spiritual gurus who can open your head and your heart up and get you on fire with the Lord. And then your 5th year spend in what we would typically call an internship. Go be Brother Justin at Siena and serve in an RCIA class, or help out in campus ministry, or be an RA in the dorm and help them, with their in their faith journey. And so we offer opportunities for internship, and then ultimately your 6th year, preparing for diaconate and ordination. And so I can tell you, it's been 25 years down the road now, and have there been some tough days? Sure, but I've never regretted it. And the people that I've met and the lives that God's allowed me to be with, I would encourage anybody to check out.
Well, I mean, that's a great way to end it. So it's been WVCR 88.3 Saints. I'm Justin Kenny as always, and with me tonight we've had the pleasure of having Father Rob Hagan. So Father Rob, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, and everybody out there in Radio Land, have a good one.